Thank you very much. Thank you, Lillian, for the introduction. I want to thank Lars Duhl and the President's Institute for inviting me here. And I'd like to thank Professor Morkides for the questions he is going to ask. Sometimes if you thank in advance, you get better questions. First, let me say it's an honor to be back in Denmark. I was the first American president ever to visit this country almost 21 years ago, in July of 1997. I thought that was surprising since we've had continuous relations between the United States and Denmark for longer than we've had them with any other nation. I hope that nothing happens in the United States to interrupt that. I am a huge fan of this country. I think Borgen was a great TV series, very realistic compared to some of our political shows. Compared to our politics, it was very realistic. I'm a big fan of your mystery writer, Sarah Bladel. She just wrote a book called The Undertaker's Daughter, which is very interesting. I even read the little book of, I'll try to pronounce it, Hugo. Right? Is that right? And now I notice whenever I'm in a room where there's a candle being lit. I say that because this is supposed to be about purpose, this meeting. One of the purposes of life that is often overlooked is to live it. And I was thinking about it now when it's such a contentious time. And when I entered politics, we actually liked it. We even liked the fights we had. We even liked our opponents and the lives they lived, and we cared whether their children were well or sick. It was a very different time. So this is what I'd like to say by way of setting up the questions. I think it's important to develop your purpose in life, in effect, by listening to your inner voice and trying to harmonize what you want to do at work or in your career or as a citizen with how you want to live. And I think it's also important to go from the outside in, to try to put yourself in the spectrum of time. I spend increasing amounts of my time now, and have for the last several years, not just on my foundation and the work we do around the world and within the United States, but also trying to help others do the same thing. Essentially, I start with the following premise. This is the most interdependent age in human history. And the power of information technology and scientific developments have made it so. They have collapsed borders one way or the other. And even if you put them back up against people who don't look like you or think like you, there's all kinds of things you can't keep out anymore. For all of you in this room and for many people in the West, this has been incredibly empowering. The technology revolution has created vast wealth. It's started staggering numbers of new businesses. It's helped to overcome all kinds of impediments to people realizing their full potential. It's done an enormous amount of good. But it also has accelerated in many countries income inequality, and a sense of distance between people, and it sort of scrambled the deck chairs in the work of establishing social solidarity. We see this every day in the United States, where there actually seems to be more social cohesion, sometimes in the most diverse communities that are also the most connected to the larger world, than there are in communities that feel left out, left behind, and looked down on, and tend to have very high rates of opioid addiction, for example. So, and there's these kind of upheavals that are occurring all over the world. When you talk about purpose, it's interesting, it's hard to have one if you don't know who you are. And yet there is a massive identity crisis occurring throughout the world. And that explains what I hope is just a momentary backsliding of democracy in many countries and the rise of more authoritarian regimes, often in reaction to people's sense of disempowerment. And if you have any kind of business, you have to be sensitive to that. Anything, it all starts with people's sense of dignity and empowerment and who they are. In an interdependent world, developments are good or bad or both. For example, one of the most important things I did as president was it took me about 2 minutes to decide to do it. And I had some opposition within my government. A technology program at the Defense Department developed GPS. And the question was, would we put it into the public sphere? And I said, of course. They said, it's ours. We spent a lot of taxpayers' money developing on this. I said, yeah, and if we let it go, it will create enormous numbers of jobs and ease the life of hundreds of millions of people. When the earthquake in Haiti occurred in 2010, Google used GPS to help us find people beneath the rubble who were still alive. And it's now sort of something people take for granted all over the world. But it has made it easier also for some terrorist attacks to occur. When I was president, I spent $3 billion of the U.S. taxpayers' money to sequence the human genome. It's the best investment America ever made. There are now more than $200 billion in private sector companies just working on applications of genome sequencing. But now we have to worry about whether people will try to rewire our genetic codes in ways that are not always good, and whether people can be discriminated against in the workplace if they're more likely to have some problem or another. The point I want to make is there is almost no such thing in human affairs as an unmixed blessing. That is, where it's all good and no problems. Almost every issue that's a breakthrough can be abused. That makes purpose more important. I believe the purpose of every citizen in the world, in private or public life, running NGOs, you name it, should be to maximize the benefits of this interdependent world and spread them to as many people as possible and minimize the problems. For me, after I left the White House, that meant setting up a foundation to try to create new partnerships between the public and private sector to do things faster, better, at lower cost than they had been or could otherwise be done. I remember when we started on the AIDS problem, there was no global fund on AIDS, TB, and malaria. President Bush had not yet set up the PEPFAR program. So I went to Ireland and Canada, two countries whose governments I was still familiar and friendly with, and said, I want you to give me $20 million a year each for 5 years, but I don't want the money. I just want you to pick the countries and promise me you'll spend it on providing AIDS medicine to keep people alive. And then I went to the Indian producers of the generic drugs and asked them to change their business model. I said, then generic drugs were about $500 a person a year. And I said, I want you, and you had to take 3 pills a day to stay alive. And only 200,000 people in the entire world outside wealthy countries were getting this medicine. Almost no kids. So I said, your business model is basically a low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment model. You have to get, compared to your cost of production, a relatively large amount of money because some of these countries don't pay even after they order. I said, suppose I could give you assurances that you would be paid immediately in an efficient way with a supply chain that works. I want you to shift your model to a low margin, very high volume, absolutely certain payment business. And because I had worked in England, in India, I said, and I give you my word, if you don't make more money, we'll tear the deal up. Because it was obvious to me that if we couldn't run this from the point of view of the producers of the medicine as a nonprofit. So they said, yes, we sent in manufacturing experts, we worked on their production, we worked on their supply chains, and we worked in the countries affected with the money given by Ireland and Canada and subsequently other countries, including some countries represented here today. Norway and Sweden gave us a fair amount of money. So fast forward to today. Today, there are approximately 36 million people in poor countries getting medicine. More than half of them are getting it on contracts that we originally negotiated. And we later did the same thing with children's medicine, with the so-called second-line drugs. About 10 to 15% of all people on AIDS in a given year can't use the original medicine. It's a devilish thing, the AIDS virus, and it mutates. So they need second-line drugs. Those are more expensive because the volume is smaller, but we got the volume of them down. Then pretty soon we were blocking mother-to-child transmission. Then pretty soon we realized we had to build healthcare systems that countries could afford to run on their own. So anyway, the thing just is gone and gone. Today, what once was a tiny project working in the Caribbean is now an independent foundation where my family and foundation, we only have a third of the board seats. We wanted to give it to the world. And it's a wonderful thing. But it all started with a different kind of partnership. That's how the Clinton Global Initiative started. So I started doing all these events for other people. I've done about 1,000 events to help raise money or the profile of other charities since I left office, because I realized that not everybody's in the same position I am to raise money and do things. So I did that. So starting in 2010, I said, everybody likes to go to Davos, all these business people do. They can ski and hobnob, and it's great. And they all talk about these problems, but nobody has to do anything about them. So we decided to have a meeting in New York at the opening of the UN where we would charge much less than they charge at Davos. You shouldn't have to pay as much to get caught in New York traffic as you do to ski on Swiss mountains. It was nothing but fair. We would charge much less, but everyone who came would have to make a commitment to actually do something about whatever they were interested in. And if they didn't, we wouldn't ask them back. I thought, this is going to be a one-year meeting. Nobody will pay money to come spend more money. But it turned out to be wildly successful. And over 12 years, we raised more than $100 billion of commitments that helped more than 400 million people in 180 countries around the world. And why? Because a lot of people wanted to help, but they didn't want to waste their time or money. And we commissioned an independent survey of all these commitments and found that approximately 80% had been fully kept or were on the way to being kept, and 6% failed. And the others we didn't have good data on because when we started, people were just filling out a little form and talking about it. And we couldn't honestly say what happened. But of the ones, this is the interesting thing, of the ones that were partnerships, that is where diverse groups work together to fill in the blanks for the others, where they helped each other, they more than exceeded their stated goals. And so it confirmed for me that generally that's where the world ought to be going. Now, if you back away from that, you say, well, what's that got to do with, you can say to me, you're losing. You know, basically the people who are more interested in keeping a larger percentage of a smaller pie are winning. There is an enormous reaction against both globalization and the diversification of cultures throughout the world. There is. That's because too many people feel left out, left behind, and looked down on, and too many others feel that there's not enough to go around. But this is where identity comes back into play in your purpose. If there's nothing you can do about interdependence, and there isn't, the whole world now is like the Middle East. The Israelis and the Palestinians may wish they weren't interdependent, but there's nothing they can do about that. So the only question is, how will it be defined? In the larger region, that's true. The only question is, how will it be defined? So, I believe you have to work for a world of shared benefits and shared responsibility and a shared sense of community. No one has to give up their own identity, their nationhood, their tribe, but they have to be inclusive about how they apply it on a day-to-day basis. Otherwise, you will be caught in an us and them world. There's a big debate in the world about this. Human instinct is to see all contests, the economy, as a zero-sum game. That's what a football game is. In order for one side to win, somebody has to lose. It's very satisfying in sports. It's a lousy way to run economies or societies. Northern Europe, Scandinavia, has proved that. You have much more positive sum. That's the alternative. In order for me to win, you have to win. Economics and social policies. And you have among both the more prosperous countries in the world and, even more important, more social mobility. That young man who was up here giving that speech before me about entrepreneurship He's the embodiment of mobility, right? He had an idea, he did something, you can do the same, you can do things, we can move. The anger in small town and rural America is the embodiment of zero-sum economics and thinking. I'm stuck. I grew up in an American state that had the second lowest income of any state in the country. When I was a little boy, I lived on a farm that had no indoor plumbing. I think I am the last American president who will ever be able to say, I once lived in a house with no indoor plumbing. It's a great political story, but as a way to live, it's way overrated. It's horrible in the winter, and if you live in a hot climate, it's worse in the summer because all the snakes come out, so by the time you're 5 years old, you have to tell the difference between a poisonous snake and a harmless one. We're laughing about this, but the point is, in a zero-sum world, there's us and there's them. If they win, we lose. If we win, they lose. If we're losing, the only way for us to win is to go get something from them. That's what's sparking a lot of this anger and resentment and rage. In a positive sum game, we all can win, but only if we find a way to help the other people win. You expand the definition of us and you shrink the definition of them. So my original purpose was to maximize the benefits and minimize the burdens of the interdependent world. That's what I tried to do as president. Then I tried to prove that you could do that as a private citizen with unusual partnerships where diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones and bring better skills to the table. And I tried to figure out how to do this faster, better, at lower cost. And now I'm back to the very beginning. If such things were available, I could have been giving this lecture when the first clans came out of caves and began to fight with each other over food. I'm just trying to prove to people that the most important thing today is to find a way, without being naive, without letting your defenses down, to expand the definition of us and shrink the definition of them. I think it is morally right, practically essential, and in the end, it will take us where we want to go. Final thing I want to say is, if we do what we should, those of you who are younger than me, which is just about everybody, looking around here, I'm glad my demographic has not been entirely eliminated. Oh, gray-haired white men in suits. I thank you so much for not cutting us out altogether. If we do it right, in spite of all the troubles, this can be the most interesting, prosperous time in history. But we have to have inclusive economics, inclusive social policies, inclusive communities, and active citizenship. It is the beginning of identity. I spend lots and lots of time today going to memorial services for friends of mine, putting out statements on people who pass away that played a role in my incredibly fortunate life from the time I was a child until I became president. And what I believe is that if you're in public life, all that matters is whether people are better off when you stop than when you start, whether children have a brighter future, whether things are coming together instead of being torn apart. In private life, it's about who you liked, who you loved, and what happened with the changing seasons. The rest of this is mostly background music. So I wish you well. But remember, when I spent all that money on the genome, most interesting thing we found is that every single non-age-related difference you can see in this room, including gender, skin color, body shape and size, you name it, every difference is rooted in less than 1/2 of 1% of your genome. To spend 99.5% of our time focused only on the 0.5% of us that is different is a fool's errand. To balance the scales leads to brighter tomorrows. Thank you very much.